Truth. Unforbidden. Truth. Podcast. Unforbidden. Truth. Podcast.
Welcome to Unforbidden Truth. I'm Andrew. On this week's episode, I'll be speaking with Mark Austin. Mark is the next of kin and longtime friend of Dennis Nilsen, the British Jeffrey Dahmer. Dennis Nilsen was a Scottish serial killer who killed at least 12 young boys and men between 1978 and 1983. He would bathe and dress the corpses of his victims before dissecting them and getting rid of the bodies by burning them in a bonfire or flushing them down a toilet. Dennis Nilsen passed away on May 12, 2018. Here is my interview with Mark Austin. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came to meet Dennis Nilsen.
Well, in 1987, I moved from college to a bedsit in North London. It was my first job. And when I moved into this bedsit, a few people used to say to me, "Oh, a serial killer used to live close by." And I never really thought much about it. I think even my parents said as much. And then I was there for about a year, and then I moved into a different part of London, and then eventually I moved out of London and bought a house in Bedfordshire, about 35 miles north of London. And I used to commute into work on the train. And one day at Euston train station, I came across the book Killing for Company. And I thought, this is the guy who people said used to live around the corner from me. So I bought that book and read it, and I just became fascinated with the man himself. I'm not into true crime any more than most ordinary people. I'm not into murderers or serial killers, but there was something about Dennis Nilsen that I just attached with him. I'm not gay. I'm not. I suppose we're both probably artistic or creative, but there was something about his personality that came across that I just got, and I couldn't join the person with the murderer, and so I read this book a couple of times, and then I wrote to Brian Masters, the author, and I said, "Have you got any more information? Can I see these notebooks?" Which the book was based on. So he invited me to his house, and we looked through these books, these exercise books that he'd written whilst on remand in prison. And I said, "This is fascinating." I said, "Do you think he'd mind if I wrote to him?" And Brian said, "Yeah, he's at Albany Prison on the Isle of Wight." So I wrote to him, and this was 1991, summer 1991, and he was in the segregation unit at the time, bored. That's what I think did it. So he wrote back, and we just started corresponding. And initially, there was the fascinating draw of corresponding with such a notorious man. But after about a year, that waned, and what was left was just a genuine friendship for what most people who have nothing to do with him would just see as a monster. But I found him to be a perfectly ordinary, decent man, human being. We had a lot in common. We shared a lot of interests. We had a lot to talk about, and that was the start of it. And he just went from there.
What was he like first starting out, like your very first letter? Was it just basically like a hello, nice to meet you, yada, yada, and then you guys just formed a friendship from there on out?
That was it. The first letter that I wrote to him was just me setting out my stall. I didn't want to give him any preconceived ideas. I was being a bit cagey, I suspect. I told him, I think I'd just got married I got married in 89, late 89. In fact, 1990, I had a daughter by Christmas 1990. So 91, I was, and the other issue was 1991, we had a big recession in the UK, probably worldwide actually. And I had a year or so before gone freelance, and I was finding it really tough. Work was drying up. I was commuting into London to sit at a desk with no work, panicking financially, just spiraling downwards. And writing to Des, um, I could sort of pour my problems out to this anonymous person. That wasn't the reason why I wrote, but that's what we ended up talking about. He would offload his problems to me. I would offload my problems to him. I do remember that first letter saying something about my crippling mortgage, because I no longer have that copy of that first letter that I wrote to him, but I've got copies of all the letters that he wrote back, and his first one says something like, "Sorry to hear about your crippling mortgage." And when I reread that a year or so ago, I thought, "Oh my god, of course that yeah, I must have been offloading to him." So it was almost like a not a therapy, but it was almost like having an invisible friend in the sky who I could talk to, and he felt the same. So it just worked from that level right up. And then a year later, I started visiting, and that opened up a whole new level of friendship.
Was he ever inappropriate with you starting on or any point in time, like sexual comments or anything of the sort?
Never, never once, never. Um, that might have been because I set out my stall at the beginning and said that I was married. Yeah, I was married at the time. 89, I was married. Not that I ever thought he would, um, because I don't think I was his target group, really. This is all in hindsight, but it never entered my head to think that that might be the case. His sexuality was never an issue. It never even really occurred to me that he was gay. Um, in fact, I only found out recently that Brian Masters was gay, and I had no idea about that either. So the sexuality was just irrelevant. Um, I mean, he would occasionally mention when we were on visits, he'd point out somebody in the visits room who he fancied, um, but he was never pointed towards me.
Was that it? Would he just point it out, or would he make, like, inappropriate comments to you?
No, he would just make normal comments that any. In fact, one of the comments we were having a joke about was that there was a female prison officer who was sitting on a stool because they had them all around the visiting room, quite high stools, and you could almost see she had a very short skirt on. You could see quite a lot, and the way that she was sitting was almost directly opposite us. So we had a real, like, almost explicit line of sight. And he was looking over saying, "My God, she's absolutely gorgeous." And we were joking that he was a closet heterosexual. But it was only sort of lads banter, really. There was nothing inappropriate whatsoever.
When you guys did visit at first, what was that first visit like? I know for me, it's always pretty awkward meeting somebody and sitting down and meeting
Yeah.
them face to face.
It was. I'd never been in a prison before, let alone a maximum security prison. But the staff were all very nice. I didn't know the protocol, but you'll know you go through a big, like a security system, like an airport control thing. The visits room, I don't know what they're like in America, but in England, they are, even in a Cat A prison, there are huge rooms with various tables and chairs dotted around. The walls are lined with 20 or 30 prison officers, and I was shown to a particular table. You're allocated a table. I sat down, and then I just watched the first visit. I watched the door in the corner where all the prisoners were coming in one by one. I suppose as they were told in their cells, you've got to visit. And then when Des came out, he was looking round. He hadn't seen me. I hadn't sent him a photograph of me, but I recognised him. I mean, this was 7 years after his conviction. And he was looking around, so I sort of waved, and he beamed a big smile and came bounding over. And because we'd been corresponding for a year by this time, so we sat down and just picked up as though we'd known each other for 30 years. It was a very natural. We smoked a whole packet of Marlboro cigarettes in the hour and a half between us. But but other than that, it was just natural, flowing, happy, um, a, a, just a good fun visit.
So what was the process with every single visit from being checked in to leaving? I know that he was considered the most high profile prisoner in the UK, I guess arguably next to Ian Brady at the time. So was there anything extra that you or he had to do being that he was so high
No,
profile?
no, because everybody in the prison was a Category A prisoner. There are Category A prisoners and Category B that are held in maximum security prisons. Category B prisoners are classified as dangerous, and Category A are classified as extremely dangerous. So the regime that they have is the difference between A and B is probably more so on the wings, what they're allowed to do, what money they're allowed to have, and so on. But on a visit, um, there was nothing particularly different from him than other things. The only thing that I did notice in later years, we were in Full Sutton prison, and there were um, prison officers. Prison officers were taking Polaroid photographs of some of the prisoners with their visitors, their family members, and we asked if we could have a photograph. But they wouldn't do it. They said his profile was too high. It could end up in the media or whatever. It wouldn't have done, but that was the reason. So it was kind of prejudiced in that sense. I mean, right behind us on one instance, there was relatives of the 7/7 bombers who were
Hmm.
being photographed with their family members um, 6 feet behind us, and Des was getting a bit pissed off with that, talking to one of the prison officers, saying, "Well, how bad do you have to be able to get a photograph?" But that was the only thing that I noticed that was any different with him than other prisoners.
Was that something that stuck forever? Did they eventually ease up on that?
They never eased up on it, and we never did get the photograph. Nope, that case for the last 15 years, 20 years. That was the time that he was in Full Sutton prison, more or less. And in prisons before then, there wasn't that option to have photographs.
When you guys would be in a visit, would you be able to buy him like food and drinks and stuff like
Yeah,
that?
yeah. There was a little canteen. There was a hatch in the early prisons. There was a little hatch that was run by two old ladies. They did it as volunteers, and it was fine, but they were so slow that I'd be standing in the queue because it was only the visitors that could get in the queue. The prisoners had to remain at their table, and I could be stood in that queue for 15 minutes in a 2-hour visit, which was frustrating. And then they experimented with machines, coke machines, and hot drinks machines. And then at Full Sutton Prison, they had a hatch system again, but it was manned by a lot younger people, and it was a lot faster turnaround. In fact, as soon as I went into the visits room and saw him and which table he was on, I would immediately just wave that I was going to go and get coffees, and I would immediately go to the hatch. And I was more or less first, second, or third in the queue anyway. So I learned through experience that that was the way to do it. Then you wouldn't be spending half the visit in the queue.
What would you guys talk about a lot of the time during visits?
What was in the news? What was going on in his life? What was going on in my life? Um, anything that, that he was doing at the time. It might have been talking about his autobiography. It might have been about something that might have been in the newspapers about him, some event that would have been taking place. A lot of the time, we'd then move on to talk about films that we'd seen or that I'd seen and he wanted to see. Um, we'd tell jokes. He was a massive Laurel and Hardy fan, as am I. So we'd often recite. We'd be talking about Laurel and Hardy films, and the pair of us would just be crying with laughter as we, um, reminded ourselves of one or two of the capers that Stan and Ollie used to get up to. Um, that was it. They were perfectly normal conversations. There's nothing monstrous. There was nothing sinister or evil. Um, it, perfectly ordinary conversations that you would have with your friend down, in some bar.
I saw in the documentary, as well as reading online, about the first time that he talked about that he was gay. I was wondering if he ever opened up about that to you more in depth than what was in the documentary or what's online.
No, he didn't. He when he was in the throes of writing his autobiography, um, and funnily enough, when I was rereading it after he died, I, I I was almost taken back because when I was reading certain sections of it, I could recall him telling me about those things when I was visiting him at the time. So, for example, there was one time he came out on a visit and he said, "It's weird, Mark, because I've just realised that throughout my whole life, I picture myself in as like in a movie frame." He said, "So you and I are sitting here now, but in the corner of my eye, I'm imagining that there's a camera watching the pair of us, and I'm almost acting towards it. You know, I'm conscious of it." And I remember we had quite a conversation about that at the time. And it was only when I started rereading the autobiography, I thought, this was when he was talking about this. Um, but about the fact that him being gay, or when he first discovered he was gay, or even the sexual abuse he alleged of his grandfather, he never mentioned it in any great detail other than just a passive remark.
Did you ever ask him about the abuse?
Um, no, I didn't think it appropriate. Or the only time we did have a fairly in depth conversation about that was when I went on a visit, and he was a bit alarmed that the police had interviewed him when the first victim was identified. And at that time, he said, I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, police came in and they showed me this photograph." I said, "Was it him?" He said, "Difficult to tell. An old black and white photograph." Um, and I said, "Well, what's going to happen?" He said, "Well, I've asked them to bring a better photograph." And he was a bit panicky about it, a bit because he'd never been able to identify that first victim. Now, when I saw him a few weeks later, the police had been again, and he had identified the first victim. But Des was more mortified by the fact that that the lad was 14 years old. And he was drunk in a bar. He said, we got chatting at close to midnight. He was drunk and he was drinking Guinness. He said he looked young, but no way did he look 14. Um, and he touched on the idea that he was mortified that the fact that people might view him as a paedophile, which you know he almost accepted that morally he was fine as a murderer, but morally he didn't want to be classed as a paedophile, which I thought was a bit strange because he did always go for younger men or older boys, I would say. So that was a bit striking when he first mooted that, and he was quite shocked at the fact that he was a 14-year-old boy.
Did he admit to having sex with the 14-year-old boy?
No, I don't think he did have sex with him. They were both too drunk, to be honest. They both just got in bed together, had more drinks back at his flat, got in bed together, and flaked out. And it was only when Des woke 2 or 3 hours later, snuggled into this youth, and just felt this overwhelming warm feeling that he wanted him to stay, and that's when the impulse came, and he strangled him.
Did he tell you what the exact feeling he had felt at the time? Was he sick? Was he just numb?
No, I mean, he's documented it in detail in his autobiography, and you can see the trajectory of how that would have come about. But the conversations that we had about it were not really that in depth. Um, he remembered it very vividly, but he didn't go into massive detail telling me about it. He wrote in massive detail, but I suppose sitting opposite somebody face to face, a friend, it would probably be a bit awkward. Um, so he didn't go into it in any detail. He told me about the outlines of it, but not in any detail.
Was that with every single crime? Did he just not go into detail much?
With me, he didn't go into detail with any of them, other than that first one, only because that was when the police interviewed him. I was on the scene when he was being interviewed, so it was topical. Um, and he was also wondering about whether he was going to be charged with that murder, and he never did get charged with it because the Crown Prosecution Service decided that it was not going to serve any benefit to charge him with it. But the but had any of the other murders being brought up whilst I was writing to him or visiting him. I guess he would have mentioned them, but it didn't, so he didn't need to mention it. Although he did document them in writing.
Did you guys ever talk about what he was doing in that 5-year timeline of killing when he was not killing, like in between kills? Was he, working a day job? Was he traveling?
No, he was working a day job. He worked in the job centre, so he was a clerk, an office boy, interviewing people. He held down a perfectly normal, easygoing job. He was well respected at work. The problem came when he went home, hit the bottle, put the music on, and his fantasy world, all the inhibitions dropped, and this is where all the problems came. He did tell me that once you kill one person, because we did have a conversation about killing one person versus killing a few people, and he likened it to having an affair. He said, if you have an affair, if you're married, you have an affair, you're panic stricken. You're thinking, oh my God, I can't believe I did it. I stepped over a line. He said, when you get to the 5, 6, 7, 8, ninth one, you're almost ringing the girlfriend whilst you're still in the house as you're heading out. You just get so complacent. Um, but this is how it all happened with him. But it was all related around alcohol. Um, but of an evening, of a weekend. But during the working week, he was Mr. Ordinary. This is the thing that's so remarkable. He was capable of holding down a perfectly normal job um, at the same time.
Did he ever acknowledge that he was an alcoholic?
No, and he still maintains he wasn't an alcoholic because when he was arrested, um, he never had a drink since, and he never had any cravings to have a drink. And he never suffered any withdrawal from drink, but he was a heavy drinker. I mean, he could drink a whole bottle of Bacardi rum in one night. Um, I mean, he'd be hungover, but he could still drink the whole bottle. Um, I mean, I like a drink. I like Scotch whiskey, but I'd be lucky if I could drink a quarter of a bottle in a night.
Right.
I don't think I'd be much use after that, let alone a full bottle.
Did he ever happen to talk about, maybe he wished he could have got help with his drinking problem or anything like that? Or maybe if he hadn't drank as much, he wouldn't have actually killed anybody?
No, he did say that um, he never saw it as a problem. He never saw it as an issue, um, and I suppose in the 80s it really wasn't. Well, the late 70s and the early 80s, it wasn't because he would um, alcoholism wasn't a big deal like it is today. It wasn't known as an illness. If I mean, even in the late 80s, when I was working in London, every single day we would all go to the pub at lunchtime and have a couple of pints of beer without question, and we'd come and continue working in the afternoon. It was just a cultural thing. Um, I would never dream of doing that now. It just would never enter my head, and it doesn't happen now. But in the late 80s, it did, and probably in the early 80s and the late 70s, it was probably even more prevalent. So he never acknowledged it as a problem, and he didn't see it as a problem. But going back to what I worked out, what I think I had in common with him, and it's not just me, I'm sure a lot of people relate to it. If I have a few drinks of a Friday night or a Saturday night, and I'm watching some amazing music, it just fills me with, it's just the most amazing feeling. You're just so chilled out and easy, and it's just fantastic. And this is what I could relate to him. The difference is he had these fantasies in his mind, um, and having that euphoric feeling that music and alcohol would bring would then put him into this fantasy world where he would be able to enact his fantasies. With the drink would take away the inhibitions, and that would be it. I mean, I've sat here watching some amazing music. I've had a few drinks, woke up in the morning and realised I've ordered a set of drums on eBay. And you think, oh my God. So I've then had to ring up and cancel that. I mean, that's the worst kind of thing that I would do. But I get the logic of you're in such a happy, euphoric mood. What when your inhibitions are down, whatever floats your boat, that's what you do. And unfortunately, with him, it was this craving to have a passive male body instead of a drum kit.
Did he ever talk about any romantic relationships that he might have had prior to being arrested?
No, because he didn't have any. The only romantic relationship he ever had, which was only really one-sided, was when he was arrested, when he was on remand, and this was for another notorious criminal called David Martin. Google him. He was more of a robber, really. He certainly wasn't a murderer, but the police hated him, um, and the two of them wound up on remand in Brixton Prison, and Des absolutely fell head over heels in love with him. And they had a few months together, but that was it. And years later, he still held a torch for this guy. He committed suicide in the end, I think in 1984, at Parkhurst Prison. And that really destroyed Des for a while. He was mortified by that. But other than that, all Des's um, romantic attachments have been with fantasy figures in his mind.
Is there a reason that he never had a romantic relationship prior to being arrested? Was it because he was like maybe socially awkward or wouldn't know how to handle a relationship?
There is a reason, and it stems from his childhood. Um, he was he was sexually abused by his grandfather up to the age of 5, um, but he didn't really realise that it was sexual abuse, as you wouldn't at 5. But his grandfather was the only male figure who showed him any attention ever. So when his grandfather came back from his fishing trips, he was on the trawlers in the North Sea. He would take little Dennis out and buy him sweets and talk to him, tell him stories. Just grandfather grandson, ordinary relationship, lovable relationship, which Des loved, craved. And but then they'd disappear off into some disused pillbox, these World War II buildings, and he would sexually abuse him. Um, then his grandfather died, um, and Des, as you probably saw in the documentary, Des's mother said, we used to say he's gone to a better place, and Des said, well, why hasn't he taken me to this better place? So he was confused about why this powerful grandfather who he adored had suddenly left him and not taken him. Then you add to that, as he got older, into his probably 10, 11, 12, he realized that he was gay. I suppose we would call it gay now, but at that time in the 40s, you wouldn't, or late early 50s, you wouldn't really know. He just thought, oh my God, I don't find girls attractive like all my friends do. So he couldn't talk about what he wanted. He couldn't talk to his male friends about fancying other boys. I mean, it was illegal apart from anything else. So he withdrew more into himself, and in order to satisfy his urges to just feel tactile warmth from the boy, he would snuggle up to his brother in bed because they shared a bed. And he would imagine that his brother was some other boy in his imagination. And this developed to such a degree that he then started to sexually abuse his brother whilst his brother was asleep. Um, I mean, this is in his early teens, maybe even before. And then that progressed to him wandering out into the woods on his own and lying down in the grass, closing his eyes and fondling himself, imagining that it's somebody else fondling him, just to try and get this craving, just to try and get this tactile, the feeling of somebody stroking you and hugging you. And this developed over years. Even through the army, he would do the same thing. He would lock himself away, say, I'm going to my room for the day, I'm going to be asleep, I'll have a few hours kip. And he'd enact out this fantasy. He'd cover himself in talcum powder, pretend he was an inert, dead body. And with his hands, he would be fondling himself and imagining himself as somebody else. And also at the same time, imagining a third view of somebody watching the two of these players. It gets very confusing. I'm seriously cutting all this down to make it manageable. But this is the logic. This fantasy thing. How it all progressed. Then it moved up to when he would go out in London and meet men on as a gay pickup. He would bring them back to his flat. They would flake out with alcohol. To the point of unconscious. And then he would use their bodies. He would play with their bodies and have sex with their bodies whilst they were completely unconscious, because this was the only way that he'd grown up. To as this is the only way he developed. Um, if you see the trajectory of it, you can almost understand it. Um, it's certainly not normal, but and I'm sure there's a lot of people who grew up gay, in the northeast of Scotland, and who had similar backgrounds and didn't turn into murderers. But we haven't walked a mile in his shoes, so you can understand the logic. Most people will watch that documentary and will read about him and just think, "Oh my God, he just murdered 12 people. Oh my God, he chopped them up and oh my God, that's absolutely repulsive. What a monster." But if you take the time to know how this all happened, doesn't make it right, but it puts some understanding on it.
Do you know if he ever got any type of like counseling or therapy for any of the abuse that he went through when he was a kid?
Never, because he didn't really acknowledge that he had been sexually abused until he was in prison. He was always trying to work out why he had turned out like he did. Um, and it was only when he went through a period of serious self analysis in prison that he put these pieces together and just came up with, oh my God, yeah, it all makes sense now, which was quite euphoric for him. um, and helps him psychologically, really, because of, don't know if you're aware, but in British prisons, I think there are about 75 prisoners who have been given whole life tariffs, meaning that whatever sentence they were given at their trial, the Home Secretary of the British government has overruled it, decided that they will spend the rest of their life in jail. And Des was one of these. But Des was the only one that wasn't on any kind of medication, any kind of prescription medication at all, because he always said he was sorted himself in his mind. He had given the police as much information as he can. He poured out all the details. He'd almost snapped back into being a normal, decent person after he was arrested, following these 5 years of being a complete psychopath. So he was right with himself. He could sleep at night.
In 1978, when these murders first started happening, were you living in UK at the time, around the area?
Wasn't in the area. I lived up north. I originate from about 30 miles north of Manchester, so 200 miles away from London. Um, and I moved down to Bedfordshire, which is close to where I am now, in '85, and I went to college here for 2 years, and then I moved to London in '87. So he'd been in prison for 4 years by then. So, but I knew the areas. I mean, when I did go to London, when I read Killing for Company, I knew all the areas that the Soho area, the theatre district, Denmark Street where he worked, all over the West End. I was familiar with all that area, as anybody who lives in London would be.
Do you remember seeing anything on the news when these young boys end up missing and ended up being murdered? Do you remember seeing anything on the news?
There was never anything on the news about it because none of these people were missing, except one. Kenneth Ockenden was reported missing. He was the second victim in '79, and he was the only one. The other 11 had never been reported missing. There was never any appeals. This is the horror of the situation, that somebody could be murdered, and I'm sure their families were thinking, "Oh, we haven't heard from whoever for a while." But a lot of these lads had left home. They'd come from Scotland or Ireland or up the north of England, and they'd come to London to run away from something, or so they had dysfunctional backgrounds, which is probably why they. I mean, if you or I had disappeared at that age, um, our parents presumably would have gone to the police, and they had a big manhunt, and but in these cases, these kids had left home, and most of them, and were almost troublesome, so they were never really missed. This is why it was so shocking when it came out that even Des himself didn't know the full count, which is why he said he thought it was 15 or 16. He just didn't know. Um, and the horror of the fact that somebody could kill 15 people or 16 people and go unnoticed for 5 years whilst living in central London in a flat is, well, I don't think you'd get away with it today. It just wouldn't happen today.
Did he ever make mention of Jeffrey Dahmer at any of your conversations?
Yeah, many times. Because Jeffrey Dahmer was, I think, arrested. I think he was caught in '92 um, or '93, and I'd been corresponding or seeing Des for about a year or so by then. Um, in fact, Des did a piece for Brian Masters that was on the front page of Vanity Fair magazine at the time, all about Des's opinion of Jeffrey Dahmer, because they are very similar. In fact, Des wrote one of his. He composed and wrote about 75 musical compositions that he calls suites, musical suites, and one of them is called "A Requiem for Jeffrey Dahmer and His Victims."
Here's an unreleased clip of Dennis Nilsen regarding his thoughts on Jeffrey Dahmer.
Well, I think this calls for a short musical requiem in memory of Jeffrey Dahmer. Nobody understood him in the world. None of the experts, and certainly none of the so-called criminal psychologists. Like most people, he was no different in the fact that we all die alone.
He felt sorry for Jeffrey Dahmer. Always said he was a misunderstood guy, similar to himself. The two of them probably had a lot psychologically in common.
So the day that Des passed away, which was May 10th, 2018, what was that like for you? Not only emotionally, but everything that followed that you had to take care of.
It was very strange because I got a call from the prison um, on the Friday morning, and somebody rang the office and said, "Can I speak to Mark Austin?" I said, "Speaking." He said, "My name is whoever." I said, "Right." He said, "I'm from Full Sutton Prison." Okay. He said, "Does that mean anything to you?" And I said, "Yeah, Des Nielsen's there." He said, "Oh, right, okay." He said, "We have been ringing everywhere to try and find you." He said, "That's why I was being a bit cagey." Um, he said, he's very unwell." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, he was taken into hospital yesterday." I thought, there's nothing wrong with him when I saw him. Well, the last time I saw him was on his birthday, the November before. And I'd had many letters since, and he was fine. My first thought was that he had been beaten up, maybe even by the prison officers. And But the guy on the phone was a bit cagey about revealing too much. So he said, "Look, the hospital has said that he's really unwell. So if you want to see him, you'd be best to come up, as soon as you can." So I rang my wife and said, "Can we just drive up to York like now?" And she said, "Yeah." And so I had to sort the office because it's my company. So I told the people that I've got a friend in York and he's unwell. So we drove up there, and I was then speaking to this person on the phone as I was in the car, and then we met at York Hospital, and we were taken into the intensive care unit where we saw Des and unconscious but covered in pipes. And we were there for about 3/4 of an hour. The consultant told us how bad it was and what had happened. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. And we had a chat with it. There was 5 prison officers guarding the door. So we even had a chat with them, and they were saying how nice a guy he was, and telling us a lot of anecdotes about Des. And then we came home, and the prison rang me the following morning, the Saturday morning, about 10 o'clock, and said he died about half an hour before. But they assigned a family liaison officer, what they call. And this guy he said, "Look, we will take care of the funeral if you want us to." That's the prison. So I said, "Yeah, fine." So they organised the funeral. They invited me to go to see his cell, which had been left untouched since he was taken out to go to the hospital. So the day before the funeral, I went to and this was in the June, so this is a month later. I went up to the prison, and the guy took me onto B wing and to his cell, which they'd cleared. They cleared all the other cells, and made sure there was nobody on the wing. And I sat in his cell that was just cluttered with all his belongings. And so for the first time in 30 years almost, I could actually imagine, I could see where he was when he was writing, when he was talking about, when he was watching the TV. I could see everything, what was out the window. And then after that, I was there for about half an hour. And then I went to meet the governor of the prison, and he was really nice, offered his condolence. And then that evening, I went to the chapel of rest and viewed his body in the coffin. And the guy at the funeral place was another really nice guy. He left me in there with Des for 15, 20 minutes. I said my goodbyes there. And then the next morning, it was a funeral, and the funeral was over in the space of 15, 20 minutes. And then I drove back because I'd stayed up north, because it's like 200 miles away from where I live here. And then I drove back the next day. And then a few days later, one of the prison officers drove down with all Des's belongings from the cell and from a central storage unit. I already had tons and tons of boxes of his stuff that I'd accumulated over the years, but he now brought the last of the stuff, and he stayed down, and we had something to eat and a few drinks here. And then he went, and that was that. He periodically sends me a text just to check in that everything's all right, but and it is all right. It's it's all fine. So the prison was very supportive with everything. They paid for the funeral. Des did have a few pounds left in his prison spending account that they were going to pass to me, and I just said give it to another prisoner or something. But that was the end of the era. And then about 6 months after that, I then set about editing these thousands of notes of autobiographical documents that he'd written, and I put them together in the now published autobiography. And I've got his ashes are just there in an urn.
He wanted to be cremated and come home with you?
Well, he was completely atheist, so he had no he didn't care what was gonna happen. We never even had the conversation. Oh, actually, I'll tell a lie. We did briefly have a conversation where he said he would like his ashes scattered at the bottom of Melrose Avenue, which is where he burned the corpses of a lot of his victims.
Hmm.
But I thought that was highly inappropriate. So when the time comes, I'll scatter his ashes in the sea, in Fraserburgh, which is his birthplace.
Besides him wanting his ashes scattered, did he have any other final wishes?
Only that he wanted his autobiography published, um, and not really for any reason other than to get his side of the story out there. Um, because everything that's ever been written about him has been written by other people who have an agenda. We did have a conversation once where he said, if you're writing a book about Hitler, for example, um, you'll have researchers doing all the research, and then somebody will come along and say, "Hey, we found this amazing story that Hitler actually used to rear injured little birds. If he found them on the floor, he'd pick them up and he'd feed them every 4 hours in the night, and he was a really loving person." And he'd say, the editor would say, "Hang on, this is a book about Hitler. We don't want anything like that in this. Hitler was a monster, and that's the line." And in the same respect, if somebody was writing a book about the Queen Mother, who was alive at the time, and then somebody said, "Oh, we've just discovered that the Queen Mother liked to shoot puppies for fun," they'd say, "You can't put that in. This is about the Queen Mother. We have to say nice things about the Queen Mother." So, of course, every book that's ever been written about Dennis Nilsen has had the underlying theme of he was a monster. Now, the crimes are monstrous, of course, that goes without question. Um, but there's a whole host of other content and explanation. It's not justification, but this comes across in his autobiography, which is what he wanted to get across. If people read the autobiography and still say he's an absolute psychopathic monster who deserves to be dead, fair enough. Then that's perfectly well and justified. Um, and that's all he wanted.
What did happen to all of his belongings? Do you still own it, or was it sold off, discarded, or donated?
I've got all of the belongings, and I am slowly selling lots of them off. Um, all of the money will be going to charity. The proceeds of the book, the royalties from the book, the autobiography, they're all going to charity. Um, I'm personally not going to financially benefit from any of this, but I know there is a big true crime. True interest in true crime is enormous, as you all know. Of course, you do. And people like to collect these mementos. But some of the content that I have, I mean, are physical possessions like books, or his keyboard, his birdcage, his copy of Killing for Company, that's signed by Brian Masters, who was the author, and Des himself, and it's annotated throughout. These are very valuable historic documents, um, and ultimately, I'm happy to sell all of those. I've got there will be some items that I'll keep just on a sentimental basis. Um, the paperwork, of which there is reams and reams of it, thousands and thousands of pages of papers, folders and hundreds of folders of papers, they will ultimately all be donated to, I don't know, criminal university, a crime university. Somebody might do a PhD, take the time to go through it. I've still got boxes of papers I haven't even looked at yet. A lot of them are all legal papers, even from the time of his trial, which I haven't even looked through in a lot of detail. So somebody could spend many years going through this and do a really detailed account of his life. He never binned anything. He kept every piece of paper, and as these boxes filled up, he handed them out. and I put them in the lockup I used to keep them in my garage, and now I have to rent a lockup to keep them all.
How did he feel about people wanting to collect signatures and his hair and fingernails and stuff like that? Did he ever talk about that?
No, because it wasn't really an issue at that point. There was a poem that came online on eBay in '94, I think it was, or '95. Neither of us knew who had put it up on eBay, but he was a bit dumbfounded that somebody would want to sell one of his poems on eBay. But
Mm.
at the time, the internet wasn't really massive. There certainly wasn't the memorabilia interest that there is now.
So let's talk about the documentary that you were a big part of, Memories of a Murderer, the Dennis Nilsen tapes. How did that documentary come about, and was this in the works while he was alive?
Um, it wasn't in the works while he was alive. That came about because I had I had written or had started to edit the autobiography. And as I was going through it, I thought, how can we get some more publicity for this autobiography? That was the original intention. And through various people, various contacts that I've been put in touch with, um, I was introduced to Raw and 11 Films, who have made some amazing television documentaries. And we just started talking about it. And the very fact that I had a lot of audio tapes um, was of interest. So they went through all those audio tapes, and um, it was just the obvious thing that they could be used in a documentary. Um, so then it was down to them to construct the documentary and to invite the other people who were on there. That was nothing to do with me. I just was I supplied the audio tapes and the autobiographical material, and the rest was down to them. And I just served as a consultant for advice every now and again when it was needed.
Was that 100% of the audio that was on the tapes, or is there anything else that wasn't used?
What is in the documentary is probably 0.2%
Oh,
of,
wow.
of the audio tapes. Seriously.
Do you plan on doing anything following up with those then?
No, I've got no plans for it at all. But a lot of the audio tapes are the ones where he's speaking. They're just conversation pieces. They're like letters. So it's not really. I mean, there are some very interesting bits in there, but the bulk of it is just mundane chit chat and
Hmm.
music. He plays a lot of music on them.
Do you know how long the entire documentary took to put together?
I would say at least 18 months. I think.
Hmm.
Um, I think Michael Hart, the director, went through the audio tapes for many, many months. He would need to go through all of them to work out how to construct, how to put them into the documentary, because there's no narrator in the documentary, and that's a very clever thing to do, to be able to have other people telling the story without a central figure saying, and then this happened, and then that happened. Um, so you couldn't have done that in a matter of a few weeks.
Was there any type of backlash while working on the documentary or being friends with Des for that matter, whether that be from the victim family members, members of the press, or anybody in general for that fact?
No, there wasn't. Early on, the Sunday Times newspaper in Britain ran a front page feature and a double page inside about the autobiography, but it was very well written, um, and it gave a good balance of why the book was written. They obviously sought the opinions of some of the victims' families, who were appalled, of course, and perfectly natural, and as I would be. Um, but um, what do we do? Do we just say, well, the victims' families will not be happy with it, so let's not publish it? There has to be a cut-off point. Do we not report on the Kosovo War because the families of those who were killed there will be upset about it. That's not in any way to disrespect what they've been through. But I don't like the line when newspapers say that the families are outraged, as though we've put this documentary out and we've put this book out purely as almost like a jokey thing. All the money, I stress again, for this is going to victims' families, obviously not specifically Des's victims, but those types of charities that help people who have suffered these huge losses. And we're also looking at charities that support IVF, with the view of being able to maybe fund 12 new people being born, which won't replace the 12 that Des killed, but it might, balance the karma of the universe in some small way.
Have you yourself been in touch with any of the victim family members over the years?
No, I haven't. I know one or two, I think, have tried to get in touch with me, and I'd be open to, but I don't really know how they would react. I have every empathy with them. I mean, I can't. I've got two children, and God forbid if anybody murdered any of my children, and I met the person who had been friends with that murderer for 30 years, I'd probably feel such anger towards them. So I'm aware of that, and I wouldn't want to antagonize or cause any additional upset or bring things back. I haven't wanted to do any of this to regurgitate any pain that they might have been suffering. It is purely to get his side of the story out, and that's been done now. The documentary's been done. That's it. It's all closure now.
Before we conclude this interview, is there anything that you'd like to add that we haven't covered yet?
In the annals of serial murderers, British serial murders, Dennis Nilsen was the stuff of nightmares. The guy who lives alone in an attic flat, wears a little suit, is speckled, goes off to work quietly, and of a weekend, he is dismembering corpses and boiling their heads and flushing them down the lavatory. It's the stuff of nightmares. And yet, if you take away those 5 years where he did this, you've got 68 years of a life of somebody who was actually pretty decent. And this is the weird thing about all of this. This is the juxtaposition of those two is almost unbelievable. I still can't get my head around that it was the same person. Even after all this time, I still can't get my head around it.
That was my interview with Mark Austin. Thank you for listening.
Unforbidden truth. Unforbidden truth. Podcast. Unforbidden truth. Podcast.